Hi all, Dr. Clark here again for animal biology. Today we're going to talk about zoology and kind of hit at it from an evolutionary perspective. So the course will be geared towards working through animals or the animal kingdom, and in doing so I will talk about the evolutionary pieces of the animal kingdom. So how uh, primitive animals gave rise to more modern animals. And some of those primitive animals we're going to have hands-on hands-on experience with them because they still exist today. And so we're going to look at the evolutionary perspective, how things have changed over time, how one group of organisms has given rise to another group of organisms, and on and on and on. And then more specifically, evolutionary features that make that a certain group very unique, okay, or a certain function in the group very unique. Okay? And then the other piece is we're going to look at it from kind of an ecological perspective. So what role does that group of organisms have in the environment? What has, say, mammals or humans more specifically done to either increase that organism's role in the environment or eradicate that organism from the planet or that group of organisms from the planet? And so we'll look at kind of an ecological perspective. So we'll look at both evolutionary perspectives and ecological perspectives. So today I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview of what I mean by evolutionary perspectives. So it might start with something as simple as a phylogenetic tree. Okay? And depending on the type of cladogram or phylogenetic tree, it will depend on what's available to you via data. So in some phylogenetic trees, it's nothing more than this is related to this, shares a common ancestor, okay, and on and on and on. In some other phylogenetic trees, there will be like traits, okay, that separate Archaeopteryx from Dinosauridae, okay, and which also would separate them from other precursors to modern birds. Okay, and so that's you'll see as we progress through the different groups within the animal kingdom that some groups are very well studied, and there are specific physical features, often morphological features, that separate these groups. And then even more so in the groups that are heavily studied, there might be a phylogenetic tree, but it might be based on genetics, actual DNA differences between the groups. So for something like precursors to modern birds, you would know that we don't have the DNA for these groups. We might have the physical features, but they're not listed here. But we've moved a long way from just saying Archaeopteryx, which was discovered in probably 1860-ish, somewhere in there, early 1860s is when the first Archaeopteryx was discovered. So from that point to now, we now know that it's not just Archaeopteryx that connects dinosaurs to birds, okay? But we have all these other transitional fossils, okay? All these other varieties of half dinosaur, half bird kind of manipulations, where we're looking at things like the coccyx. We're looking at the reduction of a tail. So, Dromaeosauridae had a distinct tail, so did Archaeopteryx, but as you start moving, some of them have much more reduced tails, and they have tail feathers that are coming off of a coxal bone, but they have a much reduced tail, all the way to modern birds, which don't have tail bones at all. Okay, and so there's other things though that we would look at, and that would be like digits. And so we know that birds don't have digits, so that they're what we call a wrist wing. So their phalanges or their digits have all been fused into a wrist, and then the feathers develop from that region. And feathers are nothing more than modified scales. Okay? And we know this because we can manipulate the genes that cause feathers to form. We can manipulate them, and instead of a feather forming there, we can have a scale form there. Okay? And there's lots of situations where we've done this. We've made chickens that have no feathers and are just purely scales, which look a lot like dinosaurs, to tell you the truth. Okay, and so there's all kinds of things that we have been able to do with the discovery of modern genetics and with the discovery of more transitional fossils. Okay, so you get both these pieces working together. Okay, and you can think of, during Charles Darwin's time, when he was talking about the evolution of lots of different organisms, and he came up with, the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. He published his book before Archaeopteryx was found, and a couple of years later, after his publication, Archaeopteryx was found. But Darwin made that connection anyways without the transitional fossil. He suggested that indeed birds evolved from dinosaurs, and which was a pretty good prediction given that he had no evidence of it, except for when you look at the anatomy and kind of the structure of the body and things like that. He put two and two together. And then Archaeopteryx was found, and then since then there's been a bunch of other transitional fossils. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about phylogenetic trees in this course, and we'll pick different groups of organisms. Sometimes we'll talk about birds, sometimes we'll talk about mammals, fish, lots of different things, and we'll just see how they're connected. And in some cases it's great because we might be, dissecting a organism that's at the very base of the phylogenetic tree and dissecting an organism that's much further up the phylogenetic tree, maybe midway, and then dissecting an organism that's the very tip of the phylogenetic tree. And so you can get how the morphology, so the physical features, have changed in those organisms over, the millions of years that they've been separated. Okay, so first of all, let's talk a little bit about just basic, definitions. Okay? Most individuals know that zoology, some people call it zoology, I don't really care one way or the not. Okay? It is not the study of zoo animals. Okay? It's the study of animals. So if you're a zoologist, it doesn't mean that you work at a zoo. It means that you study animals. Okay? And there's far more zoologists out there studying different aspects of different animals all over the world than there are zookeepers. And so, now yes, some zookeepers have zoology degrees, right? But you don't have to be a zookeeper to study animals. Okay? So when we talk about zoologists, and this will often be the field of study, or this will often be the major that a lot of people who are moving into either medical careers, moving into fish and wildlife, moving into research careers, a lot of individuals will be choosing zoology as their major. But from then, after you choose that major, you'll often get to choose a subdiscipline or multiple subdisciplines, okay, that you want to kind of specialize in. Sometimes, this is more advanced. Once you get into your master's or into a PhD, sometimes this is where you'd make those choices. But even at that, even when you're in undergrad and you've chose zoology as your major, you'll have the opportunity to take courses in the subdisciplines so you can kind of specialize in zoology. Because zoology is very big, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So maybe your subdiscipline is that you want to study one group of animals. So maybe you want to study insects, so you're going to be an entomologist, or amphibians and reptiles, so you're going to be a herpetologist, ichthyologist for the study of fish, mammologist, study of mammals, ornithologist, study of birds, and protozoologist, study of protozoa. Now, this would just be kind of a sub-discipline that you could specialize in. Okay? But you can either also specialize in kind of another aspect, and so these would be other sub-disciplines that are not based on classifying a group of organisms, but rather what is it about those organisms you want to study. Okay? So maybe you're going to study anatomy, so you can actually study the structures of those organisms, or the cell function, cytology. Okay? Or maybe you're going to study the interactions between animals and their environment, ecology. And so there's all kinds of subdisciplines or specializations that you would make if you're going to be a zoologist. I mean, there's lots of zoologists that would study, all of these organisms, okay? But they might study the parasitology, or the parasites that live on all these different organisms. Or maybe they're interested in the physiology of all ectotherms, so insects, amphibians, fish, okay? And so they're studying these groups, okay? And they're studying the physiology of those groups, okay? All right, so from an evolutionary perspective, we need to first talk about evolution. Okay? And I think in modern times, so today's era, it's important that we talk about organic evolution. Now, it's unfortunate that we have to talk about this. In my opinion, it's unfortunate. And that's really because companies and lay people have hijacked the word evolution. I mean, next time you turn on the TV or watch a commercial or something like that, you're probably going to hear things like the evolution of the Nike brand, or even if you're reading, maybe you're reading Sports Illustrated or some, sporting magazine or something like that, you probably hear the evolution of Nike, evolution of Adidas, evolution of Gatorade. And the term evolution has really been hijacked. It was kind of a biological term that meant that organisms' allele frequencies or genetics changed over time. And so, but companies stole the word and just basically used it to say, hey, we're changing, okay? And that's what they're using the term evolution for. But that's not a biological term. Evolution does not mean change. Evolution means change in gene frequency or genetics over time in a population. So now most biologists, most ecologists have had to stick organic in front of evolution so we can, give the proper definition for evolution to students. Okay? And that's change in genetic makeup of a population over time. Okay? Now, we often think about this because I think in general biology, depending on what your instructor's specialization is, okay, I think a lot of times evolution is kind of skipped over very quickly, or maybe the mechanisms for evolution are not hashed out very well. I think the problem that I find with a lot of students that are coming into animal biology is their definition of evolution is more like their definition of natural selection, that nature will select for the individuals that's best suited for the environment, okay? And that individual will live and pass on its genes to the next generation, and on and on and on, and that does change the makeup of a population over time. But that's just one way that evolution can occur. There are lots of ways that evolution can occur. So natural selection is, nature selects for organisms that best suited for the environment. Otherwise, what we call survival of the fittest. Sexual selection. Right? This is another one that is credited to Darwin, and that is that males or females are going to select their mate based on some physical feature or some feature, right, regardless of natural selection. Right? And that's how we get things like red birds, so like cardinals that sit on the top of a tree branch and sits there and calls all day. Okay, first of all, you have no camouflage, and you're red, and you're not poisonous, right? And now you're calling from the top of a tree all day long. Okay, clearly nature is not selecting for you. Something else is working. Sexual selection. Female cardinals like the color red. They also like a male that can sing for long periods of time. So they select the male that has the reddest feathers and can sing the longest and most beautiful song. Okay? And that's who's getting selected for, and that's who's passing its genes on to the next generation. This has nothing to do with natural selection. So I think that's why I bring up mechanisms of evolution. We need to talk about evolution because sometimes we'll look at evolution and we'll see a feature and we'll be like, man, how did nature select for that? That's ridiculous. Well, nature probably didn't select for it. Females, okay, because females do most of the selection, okay? Females probably selected for that. Okay? Other ways at which you can change genetic makeup over time. You can have mutations. These are at random, okay? Random changes in the genetic code. Okay? That can alter a population's genetics over time. Genetic drift. You can have very small populations that can have large swings just by chance. Okay? A lot of recessive individuals survive and reproduce, so your population moves from being equally represented genetically between dominant and recessive to most individuals are recessive. Or another switch to most individuals are dominant. Okay? And it can switch back and forth if the population is small. Gene flow. Okay, you can get the same thing with organisms coming into the population, organisms leaving the population, hybridization, so you have very similar organisms that might be coming in. Maybe they carry very unique traits that popped up from mutations or sexual selection, and now they're breeding it into your population. So you get this flux of different genetics into a population over time. Okay, so basic evolution. We'll come back and we'll talk about it a bunch more. Okay? But one of the key components of evolution, especially when we're talking about animal evolution, is this principle that we call structure equals function, okay? Or structure indicates function. Okay? And so there are lots of features that we'll talk about in different groups of animals that are specific to that group of animals and indicates a specific function. Okay? And some of this information, especially with modern technology and with genetics and things like that, we have been able to distinguish exact features and the exact genes that have been mutated to cause those features to indicate some function. For example, there is a group of fish in Lake Victoria, right, in Africa, which are called scale-eating cichlids. Okay? And so Prosodus mercolepsis. Okay? Now, just like humans, some of them are right-mouthed or left-mouthed, which means that their mouth actually curves either to the right-hand side or it curves to the left-hand side. And so you can see here that some of these fish, okay, their mouth is curved left. This mouth over here is curved to the right. Okay, and this is just a flip of the fish. And that is so they can swim next to another fish and they can bite scales off. So they can swim right up, get really close, and they can bite their scale off. And that is the diet of this species of fish. That's what they eat, scales. Right? And when they pull the scale off, there's a little bit of flesh on it, okay? And that's where they get their nutritional value. And so again, the structure, whether you're right mouth or left mouth, determines what side of the fish you're going to swim next to, and determines like how you're going to approach a fish. Right? And so it's very simple things, and we know that genetically this is a single gene that causes the manipulation of their mouth to either be right curved or left curved. Right? There's lots of examples of this, and we'll talk about these throughout the entire semester. Right? But there's examples that, for a long time, right, because they were discovered a long time ago, scientists were, rather confused about what the structure meant. So take dragonflies, for example. So if we look at dragonflies, we know that they have this very strange kind of sexual relationship where this is the male, the blue one here, and he's reaching back and he has a pair of pinchers, sometimes called claspers, at the end of his abdomen. So at the end of this very long abdomen, that he reaches over and he grabs the female behind the head, right in front of what we call the prothorax. And so he holds on to the female. Now, males in insects, along with a lot of organisms, their sperm ducts are down here at the base of the tail. But you know that the male is not going to be fertilizing the back of the head of the female. That she doesn't have reproductive organs. She has her reproductive organs here. So what the male does is he pumps his sperm all the way up a sperm channel and into this region, the beginning of the abdomen, and then he can fertilize the female. But before he does that, he sticks his penis inside the female, and it looks like this. So for a long time, entomologists and scientists were confused, like, why is the male, penis of dragonflies, why is it forked? What's the deal with these two projections? Why does it look this way? And they really didn't know. But then they found out that this is due to sperm competition. So the male actually has the ability to insert his penis inside the female, which this is the female's reproductive organ. She has two sperm ducts, or sperm sacs, where she can store sperm. And that male can take his penis and he can scrape the sperm that she's stored inside of her out and then inject his own sperm in. So we're going to watch a little video that shows this kind of in action. But again, this is just showing you that when you see a feature in an organism and it might look confusing to you, if you work it through, if you examine other organisms, if you examine how pieces might fit, and you study it long enough, you can get an answer to why that specific feature might have evolved. Clearly, if you can increase the amount of offspring that are fertilized by your sperm as a dragonfly by scraping out the sperm of others, that over a long period of time, your penis will probably fit the cavity much better than what it did originally, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to watch this little clip about the mating of dragonflies.
The male's claspers and the female's neck fit together like a key in a lock. Coupled together in this way, they can fly perfectly well in tandem, something no other insects can do. Their mating, too, is unique. The male's mating organ is at the front of his body under the base of his wings, but his sperm, as in all insects, is produced at the tip of his tail. Curling his body, he pumps the sperm from back to front. The female now grips the front of his abdomen with the tip of her own, creating the well-known dragonfly mating wheel. The mating of dragonflies is even more complex than it looks. In good weather, the female mates for several days with different males, laying several clutches of eggs. Thus, she carries a good deal of sperm. A new male drives out competing sperm with this powerful movement. A look inside shows what happens in detail. The female below has a large mating receptacle with 2 sperm sacs. Through this channel, the oviduct, the eggs will eventually pass. The male's mating organ with 2 extensions at the tip is well inside the female's receptacle. The sperm inside is from an earlier mating with another male. The male's first job is to expel this foreign sperm. Only when the mating receptacle and the sperm sacs are nearly empty does the male inject his own. The next time the female lays eggs, it will be his sperm that fertilizes them. When this process was first discovered in dragonflies, people began to look with new eyes at mating behavior throughout the animal kingdom. It was no longer seen simply as a means of continuing the species, but as selfish competition between individual animals. The expelled sperm sticks to the tip of the female's abdomen. She tries repeatedly to wipe it off. To ensure his success, the male must now keep his territory and, above all, his mate under close surveillance. To avoid attacks from other males, the female dives underwater to lay her eggs. She bores a new hole for each egg with her ovipositor. Only now are the eggs fertilized. They'll take a few weeks to hatch.
Okay, so there you could see the kind of the mating ritual of dragonflies. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that these are actually not dragonflies, okay? And the video was not dragonflies either. They're called damselflies. And we'll learn more about the differences between dragonflies and damselflies. Now, their mating processes are pretty much the exact same, and their features are very similar. However, just to make sure that you specifically know that they're not actually dragonflies, they're damselflies. It's a different group. Okay, they're called Zygroptera. But at any rate, the other piece that I want to talk about is that, we're looking at structure and function. The other nice thing that we see is you can look at different species of damselflies or dragonflies, or lots of other invertebrates, insects, have the capability of sperm competition and things like that, and have different shapes and structures of their penis. But to tell the difference between one species of damselfly and another, I mean, look here. This male is blue and this female is green, so color is not going to do it for you, because the female could just be green and the male could be blue. Color really doesn't make a difference when we're talking about species. Now, there are wing vein morphology that separates species, but another way that you could do that is to dissect them and examine their penis. Their penis will be very specific to a female because her sperm duct or sperm cavity receptors have a very specific shape. And so one male's penis will not fit with another species of female's sperm cavity or sperm duct. And so you'll see these connections between those, okay, which shows that these organisms have evolved together for a long period of time, and it probably came from a common ancestor that had, maybe no forked penis, but rather maybe just one thing that could maybe scoop out a little sperm and gave it a little bit of an advantage, and now it's got to a point where it's true sperm competition and the male has a distinct advantage by doing this. Okay? All right, so when we're talking about organisms, when we talk about these features, and we talk about whether there's separate species or genera or things like that, we need to talk about how we classify organisms. Okay? And so prior to modern times, really prior to what we call the genetic generation, which is basically from the mid-90s on, okay, we were classifying organisms prior to the mid-90s based on mainly morphology. What was their physical appearance? Okay? Did they have certain physical features? And if they did, they're probably in the same species. Okay? As long as they could mate together and produce viable offspring, which is what we call the biological species concept, then they're the same species. Okay? Well, modern times have went a little bit further. Okay? We now know that just because you can mate with another organism and produce a viable offspring should not mean that you're the same species. For example, you can take a rainbow trout and a cutthroat trout and you can mate the two together and they produce viable offspring. You can take lots of salamanders and things like that and even some frogs and you can mate them together, different species, and get viable offspring. Fish, you can do this with a lot. Okay? Plants, you can do this all the time. Okay? And, other organisms don't even reproduce sexually. So like bacteria and some protozoans and things like that, they don't even produce sexually, and even some animals don't produce sexually. So classifying them based on whether or not they can produce viable offspring through sexual reproduction is not a very good system. So probably from the mid-90s on, we started to look at a different way at which you could classify organisms. And that's by what we call the phylogenetic species concept. So in other words, you're looking at this, the classification based on relatedness. Okay? So that relatedness could be by examining morphology, the physical features, but it also could be by examining the genetics of a group. Okay? Based on that, you then can come up with some kind of nomenclature or naming system. Carl von Linné came up with what we call the binomial nomenclature. So this was after the time of Carlos Linnaeus, okay, who came up with the hierarchical ranking of organisms. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, that's Linnaeus' system. Okay, Carl von Linné added to that and said, well, given a single organism, we should give them a two-part name. One part being the genus and the other part being the species. Okay? Or, in other words, a binomial nomenclature. Okay? And so for us, it's Homo sapiens. Okay? Homo being the genera, okay? And it's always capitalized, okay? And the species is never capitalized. Okay? The other thing is when typed out, the binomial nomenclature is always in italics. Okay? When written, handwritten, since no one writes in italics, you underline it. Okay? But again, genera is capitalized, species is lowercase. So here we can look at kind of that classification. Now again, Linnaeus came up with kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. These right here, from work with ribosomal RNA, right, or what we call rRNA, we then realized that we need another classification. We need to decide what domain these organisms reside in. Are they archaea? Are they bacteria or eubacteria? Or are they eukarya? Okay? And so in this case, in this course, since we're dealing with animals, all animals, that kingdom, belong into eukarya, meaning that they have a true nucleus in their cells. Okay? From there, we are going to be dealing with a bunch of different phyla. Okay? So if we're dealing with things like arthropoda or joint-footed organisms, okay, we're in that phylum. If we're dealing with things that have a notochord or resemblance of a notochord, that could be the spinal cord, okay, we're going to be dealing with chordata. Okay? And so classes are going to be different too. Okay? So in this case, arthropoda, hexapoda, meaning six feet or 6 legs, okay, which we consider the true insects. Okay? And order in that is Diptera. You might have a couple different families, Muscidae, Tambiidae, okay, and you might have the domesticata or the Musca domestica, which would be your housefly, and the Tambianus abusca, okay, Opasca, okay, which is going to be a horsefly. So you can see how these are broken out. Same thing here, okay, classes. We can break the chordates into different classes. Osteichthyes, which means bony fish. Mammalia, mammals. Okay, Pisiformes. Okay, the Cichlidae. Parasaurus microlepis. Okay, those are the scale-eating cichlids. Okay, and then, you know, us, we belong to primates. Hominidae. Homo is our genera, Homo sapiens our species, okay? And that's how we classify different organisms. So in this course, we're going to be starting, okay? We'll talk about what makes something an animal, so we'll talk about the kingdom part, okay? But then we're going to really start with these phyla, okay? And we're going to look at all the different phylas that fall under Animalia. And we're going to look at some of the classes that fall within, okay? And then in lab, we'll be dissecting specific species within some of those classes. Okay? And so you'll see when we get to lab that it'll be important to be able to backtrack to find out, okay, well, what class am I in? Even what order am I in when I'm dissecting these species? Okay. And so when we're talking about phylogenetic trees, they can be as simplistic as a phylogenetic tree like this, which is basically tracking all chordata. Right? So you have chordates, okay? And not all of them. We're missing a group of chordates down here, but majority of chordates are on here. Okay? And so you might have cartilaginous fishes, so they don't have any bone, it's cartilage. The ray-fin fishes, the lobe-fin fishes, which gave rise to the tetrapods, and then anything with 4 limbs, okay, and how they're broken out and how they're related here. Okay? And so that's a pretty broad, simple phylogenetic tree. You can see it's just showing you that organisms have common ancestors. It's not showing you really any data that or any distinct features that would separate those groups or how long they've been separated and things like that. But we can go more specific. So we could say, you know, wolves gave rise to all varieties of dogs. Okay? We know this. So we can look at, you know, the wolf. Now there's some varieties of wolves. They're not all just, you know, the European wolf. So there's different, okay, so there's the China, Northern European, okay, the Balkans, Italy, Spain, Middle East, Near East, okay. So there's quite a bit of variety of wolves, okay, but they did give rise to kind of all modern dogs. And so this is a much more complex phylogenetic tree that's basically looking at all the breeds of dogs that we have in the world today and how they are related back to wolves. Okay? And in essence, you can also break off some, sister groups. We know that coyotes did not give rise to modern dogs, and coyotes and wolves are not the same species, so we can have these outlier groups that don't belong to anything and really are not connected with the rest of the puzzle. Okay? But show similar features as some of those other organisms. Okay? And so we'll go through examples of this. We'll do very broad phylogenetic trees, and then there will be situations where we're like, all right, well, let's look at something, as specific as dogs, okay, or specific as cats, or specific as, bony fish, and we'll examine a phylogenetic tree from there. Okay? So that's kind of the evolutionary aspect to zoology, okay? And that's kind of how an evolutionary point of view would be placed. We'll talk a lot more about evolution. We'll go through, a review of kind of Darwin's role and all the other players, and what has modern genetics done for zoology in future lectures. Okay? So with that, next time I'm going to talk about the role that ecology plays in zoology.